Hello, everybody. This is Daniel Wang again, and we're here today presenting the fourth episode of Talking Dance Music with myself and Electronic Beats TV, based here in Berlin, Germany. Today, the record that we'll be talking about is probably the most personal record to me in my record collection, simply because it's something I searched for on a mission with great passion and curiosity for 16 years until I found it. And it's kind of a story, with a little back and forth. As you may know, these are cassette tapes. In that era before MP3 over 30 years ago, we couldn't just go on internet and find the song that we had heard last night. There was, of course, no Shazam. A friend of mine had just gone to New York, gone out to underground dance clubs, and he had taped off of the radio a late night mix by Mr. Tony Humphries. He's another person I have to thank because the first record I ever released in 1993, that was 30 years ago, was also first played on the radio late night by Mr. Tony Humphries. It is kind of personal history, all of this. And maybe it's the beginning of this whole obsession and madness with dance music and electronic music. So what was this thing? It was on this cassette tape. Tony Humphries had been playing it, I guess, between Ultranate and some other underground track. It had a beautiful, liquid, acid 303 kind of sound. I didn't even really know what a 303 was back then. This was 1991. I was just out of college. And it haunted me. It was just beautiful pads, it had a beautiful piano solo at the very end. So every time I had a chance to travel to New York or Chicago, or maybe a friend from Finland or from Paris, these were some of the DJs who were already playing around Europe and the US back then. They'd come over and visit. We'd ask them, do you know what this track is? Have you ever heard it before? And no one knew what it was. So around year 2007, and this is still before everybody went on social media and Facebook, I can't remember who it was, but a friend called me and said, hey, guess what? I think we found that track that you're looking for. I think YouTube was just getting popular at the time. We went online and we found it. It was this record, Dream to Science. In 2017, when we found it, I instantly went on Discogs, searched, and there was only one copy. It was in mint condition, and it cost $45, which seemed like a lot of money at the time. I didn't hesitate. I bought the record, and that is this very piece of vinyl I'm holding in my hand. I guess I should play it so you can hear what it sounds like. And at the very end, there was this really beautiful acoustic piano solo, which also was a bit of a surprise. Came at the end. Before we found this record on internet, of course, we went through all the different options. I'll just show some of these. We thought this has that really moody, late night, beautiful sound on Nervous Records and Strictly Rhythm Records at the time in the early 90s. That was a sound that was kind of the sound of those days. There was this guy named Wayne Gardner who made some really nice records like Classic Man. Here he is. And he made a record called Essence, Just a Touch. This was on Strictly Rhythm Records. It had that same moody vibe and the synth sort of acid-like bass line. But we searched through his catalog, really love those records by him. It wasn't exactly this. And of course, the sound kind of resembled something like Mr. Fingers. Here we have Mystery of Love. I think this was about 86 or 87. Same period as those early Adonis records and Tyree Cooper records. And, you know, everybody knows this, Can You Feel It by Mr. Fingers, right? With or without the Martin Luther King speech. Yeah, Mr. Fingers, What About This Love? But it wasn't exactly this either. It was really a mystery to us. And we searched through those old Chicago acid records. Here we go, Adonis, House. Here we have a classic acid, the original house sound of Chicago. Classic acid, here we go. Tyree Cooper, Adonis, The Poke, Acid Thunder by Fast Eddie. You know, these all had that fluid, tweaking, sort of synthy acid sound, but they weren't exactly like this record, Dream to Science, which we'd been chasing so long. So now that I had discovered this Dream to Science record, there was this mystery of who is this man named Mr. Ben Chenak. I mean, he wasn't really on the disco or house map. He wasn't from Chicago. And only from friends in Berlin here, I learned, 2007, I was already living here, just had moved here a few years before that, that this was a man who's quite well known in the genre that we now call electro, or it's a kind of early New York electric hip hop from the early 80s. And Nucleus, anyone ever heard of this? When was this year? 1983. For example, Jam on It, Jam on Revenge, Wiki Wiki Rap. I think anybody who's a b-boy or who was out breakdancing in the early mid 80s knew these sounds. You'll recognize them too, I think. Like sounds like this. A prop. Amazing. Yeah, it's also the sound again of the 808 drum machine by Roland, the same company that made that TB303, you know, and the SH101 and all those others. There were a few other hits. So here we are, Nucleus again, N-E-W-C-L-E-U-S. Let's Jam, again produced by Mr. M.B. Chenak. Okay, here we go. Electronic. Not my best effort. Love it. Right? That's a bit of Nucleus. That's a B-side dub version, you know, just so you get an idea of the beats and that sound from that era. Again, this is 1985, so it's 2 years after that hit. And, you know, there's some records like here, Nucleus, Na Na Beat. Okay, I guess I should show you the other records too. I'm sure you've seen these. Yeah? Jam on Revenge, Jam on It. And Space is the Place. Here's this wonderful album, the whole Nucleus album here. Okay. Produced by Joe Webb and Frank Fair, and produced and arranged by, again, Ben Chenak, my hero. Space is the Place.
Yeah. Sky's the limit. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a little taste of Space is the Place by Nucleus, you know, Mr. Ben Chenak. And again, this is not a sound, personally, I was going out to dance to. I mean, I loved watching that, but I definitely was not a b-boy or a breakdancer. I think I'd probably break my neck if I tried to do some of those spins that those people did in the streets of Bronx and New York City. So, still the connection to house music, was there one? Oh, yes. There was a very, very big connection to house music. And it would be summed up in this record, Nucleus, Alto Man. And just to mention this, now I'm living here in Germany. This is a New York produced record, but it was a huge hit here in Europe, and I think especially in Germany, in cities like Frankfurt, Hamburg. You would hear this everywhere. So from the very start, give it a listen.
Storm. Her senses told her that it was wrong. She was a young lady of 23. He was a child of technology.
But quite funny thing is, you ever heard of a really big hit by Snap called Rhythm is a Dancer? The same record, Auto Man, now switch it speed from 45 to 33 and listen to this. It might sound very familiar to you. Recognize the sample? Or maybe it was played, we don't know. Sound a little bit familiar? Rhythm is a dancer, you can feel it, ba-ba, you can feel it everywhere. Rhythm is a dancer, oh, da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, you can feel it in the air. Whoa, it's a passion, whoa, you can, ba-ba-ba. I can't reach those notes, sorry. Sound familiar? Okay, well that's where they got it. Snap, Rhythm is a Dancer. Nucleus, Auto Man. But now back to the record itself, Dream to Science. Maybe you want to hear how this record sounds. I mean, it's actually not just one track. There are 6 tracks on this EP, and they're all kind of this deep 303, bassy, deep house sound from the early 90s. And the other side, which is, what is this?
Just touch me gently and my love will show.
That's My Love Turns to Liquid, and there's Breathe Deep here, which has a great, very So that has a very deep, simple bass line. I guess it's got 5 notes maybe in it. And a bit like old Fingers tracks. And there's even a track here called Mystery of Love. Ben Chanek said he knew of Mr. Fingers, was definitely influenced by Chicago House, but this is his own take, Mystery of Love.
Mystery of love, where can it be? I dream of a paradise.
Sounds a bit like Mr. Larry Heard and Robert Owens jamming, right? In Chicago. That's Ben Chenak's take. But of course, the main title track that I was so obsessed with is Dream to Science. Let's give it another listen. Okay. Okay, and here I've got a terrible confession to make to all of you viewers here. This is the one time I think I will not be able to reconstruct it very correctly. I'm going to tell you something. I've been obsessed with this record now for what? Over 20 years. I never really tried to reproduce it myself. Even very recently, a couple years ago, I started buying 303 emulators and things that have that sound. You know, it's a very particular machine, the 303. Tried it this morning. You know what? I already programmed it into my SH01 here. Give it a listen, and please don't laugh, because it's not a perfect reproduction. It's an approximation. Okay, let's switch over. Please don't laugh. Okay, and in reproducing this thing, I really, first I tried to do it manually, just with ears and doing that grid thing, the little boxes that you've seen me do in the past with Adonis and with Maze Twilight. Since that didn't work out, I went into my Logic sequencer, my computer, and played it in. And again, all I can say is this is Ben Chanak's Dream to Science mid-range 303 synth motif. And this is an approximation, as close as I could get, on my MIDI sequencer. Look at this. This is maybe the most complicated TB303 acid synth line ever released on a well-known house record. It's got 19 notes, look at all these, over 32 beats, over 2 measures, and in between these notes, there are 14 points where there's a legato. That means 14 presses of that button on the TB303. You know, you've got a reproduction here, which makes a connection between 2 notes. I wonder what kind of musician would write this kind of synth line. And I have the strong feeling it didn't just happen by accident. This is the chart I used to reproduce it roughly on my SH01. And I have to say this, I'm excusing myself maybe. And this might be a challenge for everybody out there. If you've got a real TB303, try to do this line. It's an approximation of the Dream to Science synth motif. And I think really relevant why I feel like I didn't get it right. It doesn't sound exactly right. The TB303 has accents, maybe you know that. It's specific to the 303, and that adds extra emphasis on the volume and the filter. Also, there are extra knob gestures, as you know, people are twisting and turning the knobs and increasing the portamento a little bit while we're recording live. Maybe Ben Chanak did that while recording, and also without effects added in the mixdown. Sometimes a little bit of delay or reverb can really change the feeling of a synth line. And furthermore, interestingly, you know, if you listen to Automan and some of the other records that Ben Chanak did, there's a mid-range synth motif, like on Automan, da 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 do 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 do, like an arpeggio, and then there's a deeper synth bass line happening underneath. And this is even a technique which shows up a few times on records made by Adonis. For example, Lack of Love, if you listen to it, there's a mid-range, very quick TB303 line going dun 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 ba-dum 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 ba-ba, and then underneath there's a deeper bass line. And on Dream to Science, we actually have something similar. We have a bass line playing a sort of sub or lower bass, and it's going 1 1 3 4 5. It's going dun, 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 something like that. Not singing it in tune. But look at how complicated this bass line is. Look, this is 19 notes over 32 spots. And all these little arrows represent the place where he put in a legato to connect notes to make them slide and give that little liquid 303 feeling. It's really complicated. I've never encountered or tried to reproduce such a complicated acid line before. Still wondering how he did it, but he did it. And that's why, and put in his musical brains and incredible sense. And maybe that's why we're still chasing it. And everybody's still playing this thing after such a long time. So the chords on the top are actually very simple. The bass line basically, or the song is basically happening in C sharp. And it's at about 120 BPM. And it's also interesting because if you play this record at 120 BPM and you pitch it down a bit, listen to this. So the chords are basically a C sharp minor 7 and an F sharp major 7, okay? Let's slow that down a bit. Now, even though the record sounds very moody, when I was looking at those chords, C minor 7 and F major 7, I suddenly remembered that probably the start of all house music goes back to something on Salsa Orchestra. I don't know if you know this record. And that is Love is the Message. And Love is the Message is kind of related to this track. If you've ever seen, this is a Salsa Orchestra sheet music written by this guy named Vince Montana. And Love is a Message was put together by Leon Huff and Kenny Gamble on the Philadelphia sound. Again, these guys all worked together in the studio around 1973 to 1975. Look at the chords on Chicago Bus Stop. C minor 7, F7, F major 7. If you pitch Dream to Science down to this, it's playing the exactly same chords as Love is the Message. So there we go. Now, I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it exactly, but if I pitch Dream to Science, which is at C sharp, and that's only one semitone above, if I pitch it right down here, it's basically, you can hear that. It sounds a bit darker, it's got a slightly more melancholic tone, but it's basically the same chords at the same tempo as Love is the Message. C minor 7 and F major 7. And again, I think this is probably a coincidence. This is just what jazz musicians and people who work in this kind of music do. You find 2 or 3 chords that sound good together, and we've talked about that before, those 7th chords and 9th chords, and Mr. Chenak certainly adds some beautiful 9ths and some floating things on the top, but it's basically a sort of a modern 90s updated version, a more moody version, but an extremely similar composition. Yeah, so when Dream to Science was reissued in 2012, interestingly, there was an interview on a website here with Mr. Ben Chenak, aka Cosmo D, and he talks about some of his favorite old disco records and house music bass lines which influenced his music. And right at the top of the list is MFSB, Love is the Message here, this Brooklyn national anthem in the 1970s and 80s. Most people who went out dancing in the 80s and 90s in New York City, I was one of those people, certainly know this. Amazing sax solo, amazing electric piano solos. Again, so, you know, is it just coincidence? Is it just artists who get into a mood, you know, create an aesthetic, pass on a kind of aesthetic or feeling in the work that they do? I think it's just one of those cases. I don't think there was anyone copying anything. I think this is just the natural thing that a musical mind like Ben Chanak would just do. But it's a pretty funny sort of coincidence when you think about it. So, thanks again, everybody, for watching this brief episode this time of Talking Dance Music. We presented a rather unusual record, a real cult house record from 1990 by Mr. Ben Chanak, aka Cosmo D. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope by listening to the record and maybe checking some of these references also of its connections to the past, that we can better appreciate, better enjoy this music, and maybe even go out and dance to it at a club next weekend. Thanks for watching.